How did a small family in the desert become a nation that shaped history? From Abraham's promise to the fall of kingdoms, from slavery in Egypt to exile and survival, nothing could erase them. Empires came and went, but the Jewish people held on. Through war, persecution, and miracles, they walked the path of destiny. After 2,000 years, they returned home. But how? What kept them alive? This is more than history. This is the untold journey of Israel. Let's begin. History is filled with powerful empires and mighty rulers. Yet the story of Israel does not begin with a king or a great army. It begins with one man, alone in the vast wilderness, listening to a voice that no one else could hear. A man who dared to leave everything behind, guided only by faith. The sun burned high in the Mesopotamian sky, casting golden light over the great city of Ur. It was a place of towering ziggurats, bustling marketplaces, and gods carved in stone. But in the heart of this thriving civilization lived a man unlike the rest. His name was Abram. One day, a voice called to him, a voice unlike any he had ever known. It was not the voice of idols, nor the whisper of the wind. It was something deeper, something eternal, and it spoke a command that would change the world forever. Leave your land, your birthplace, and your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. Leave everything? His home, his people, the comfort of certainty. It was madness, and yet, in his heart, he knew this was no ordinary call. This was destiny. Abram did not hesitate. With his wife, Sarai, and his nephew, Lot, he turned his back on the world he knew and stepped into the unknown. He did not know where the road would lead. He did not ask for a sign. He simply believed. And so, the journey of a nation began. Not with an army, not with wealth, but with faith. Through endless deserts and treacherous lands, Abram traveled, his footsteps carving the first path to the land that would one day bear his people's name, Israel. One night, as he stood beneath a sky filled with 1,000 stars, the voice spoke again. Look up at the heavens and count the stars. If indeed you can count them, so shall your descendants be. A promise, a covenant, a bond between the eternal and one man. But how could this be? Abram was old, and Sarai had no children. And yet, the words echoed in his soul. The God who created the stars could surely do the impossible. Time passed, and just when hope seemed lost, the miracle happened. A child was born, a son, Isaac. Laughter filled their home, for Sarai, now Sarah, had given birth in her old age. The impossible had come true. The promise was alive. But faith is never without trials. And the greatest test was yet to come. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. The words must have shattered Abraham's heart. The son he had prayed for. The child who carried the promise of generations. How could he give him up? Yet without question, Abraham obeyed. He walked for 3 days, each step heavier than the last, until he reached Mount Moriah. He built an altar. He bound Isaac. He raised the knife. Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. A ram appeared, caught in the thicket. A sacrifice had been provided. The test was over. Abraham had proven his faith, and in return, the covenant was sealed. Because you have done this, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Abraham's journey was not just a personal test. It was the foundation of a people, a destiny carved into time itself. The land of Canaan, the land promised to his children, would be their home. But the path would not be easy. Struggles, wars, and exile lay ahead. Yet through it all, the covenant remained unbroken. Empires would rise and fall. Kingdoms would crumble. But the children of Abraham would endure, because this was not just a promise, it was a destiny. The descendants of Abraham had grown in number, just as the covenant had promised. But instead of thriving in the land of Canaan, they found themselves in Egypt, at first welcomed, then enslaved. The Israelites, once free people, now toiled under the scorching Egyptian sun, their hands bound by chains, their backs scarred by the whips of their masters. Had God forgotten his promise? Had the covenant been broken? For 400 years, their cries rose to the heavens, and then, when all hope seemed lost, a child was born. A child who would change everything. Moses was no ordinary man. Born at a time when Pharaoh had ordered the death of every Hebrew baby boy, his mother had done the unthinkable. She placed him in a basket and set him adrift on the Nile, praying for a miracle. And a miracle came. The baby was found by Pharaoh's daughter and raised as a prince in the very palace of the man who had condemned his people. Yet deep in his heart, Moses knew he did not belong to Egypt. One fateful day, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Rage overtook him, and he struck the man down. Now a fugitive, he fled into the wilderness, leaving behind his royal life. For years, he wandered. And then, on an ordinary day, everything changed. A bush burned before him, yet it was not consumed. And from within the fire, a voice called his name. Moses, Moses, I have seen the suffering of my people. I have heard their cries. Now go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. Pharaoh laughed. The Israelites were his slaves. He would not set them free. And then the first plague struck. The waters of the Nile turned to blood. Fish rotted, and the great river, the lifeblood of Egypt, became a river of death. So another plague came, and another. Frogs swarmed the land. Darkness swallowed the sky, and boils covered the bodies of the Egyptians. Each time, Pharaoh hardened his heart. Until the final plague, the night when death itself swept through Egypt. In every home, the firstborn lay lifeless, except for those who had marked their doors with lamb's blood. The angel of death had passed over them. Pharaoh could no longer fight. He called for Moses and uttered the words that changed history. Go. Take your people and leave. The plagues, the fall of a god-king. Moses returned to Egypt, his heart pounding. He stood before Pharaoh, once his family, now his enemy. Let my people go. Pharaoh laughed. The Israelites were his slaves. He would never set them free. And then the first plague came. The Nile turned to blood. The fish died, and a stench of death filled the air. But Pharaoh's heart remained cold. Then came frogs, swarming the land. Gnats, flies, disease, boils, hailstorm and fire, locusts, darkness so thick it could be felt. Each time, Pharaoh refused, until the final plague, the night of death, the first Passover. Moses gave the warning. Tonight, every firstborn in Egypt will die. But if you mark your doors with the blood of a lamb, death will pass over you. The firstborn of Pharaoh was dead. Broken and defeated, Pharaoh called for Moses. Go, take your people and leave. The Israelites, 400 years in chains, were free. But the journey was not over. The sea that split in two. They marched into the wilderness, their hearts racing with new hope. But then, behind them, a sound, a distant thunder. Chariots. Pharaoh had changed his mind. He was coming for them. Before them lay the Red Sea. Behind them, Pharaoh's army. Trapped. Terror filled the people. Did you bring us here to die? But Moses raised his staff, and a miracle unlike any before unfolded before their eyes. The sea split. Walls of water rose high, a dry path appearing before them. With trembling steps, the Israelites walked through, the impossible made real. Pharaoh's army followed. And then, with a crash, the waters returned. Egypt's mightiest soldiers were swallowed by the sea. The Israelites stood on the other side, free, truly free. They had escaped Egypt. But they were not yet a nation. Mount Sinai, when heaven touched earth, 50 days after leaving Egypt, They arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai. Thunder roared, lightning split the sky, and the mountain trembled as fire consumed its peak. Then, silence. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The 10 Commandments were given, the laws that would shape them, not just as a people, but as a nation with a purpose. For the first time in history, a people were not ruled by kings or conquerors, but by a covenant, a direct bond with God. But a nation is not forged in an instant. And the greatest test was yet to come. The wilderness, 40 years of fire and trial. The promised land was near. But the Israelites were not ready. Again and again they doubted. They questioned Moses. They feared the future. Why did we leave Egypt? We had food there. We were safe. Had they forgotten their chains so quickly? And so they wandered. For 40 years they walked the desert, tested again and again. Those who doubted, who longed for Egypt, did not see the promised land. Only their children would. Moses, the man who had led them, would not enter either. His journey ended atop a mountain, overlooking the land he had longed for. And then a new leader rose. Joshua, strong and fearless, led them forward. The first battle was Jericho, a city with walls so high no army could break them. But the Israelites did not fight with swords. They marched. For 7 days they circled the city. And on the 7th day they blew their trumpets. Victory after victory followed. The Israelites, once slaves, were now warriors. And at last, after centuries of waiting, they stood in the land promised to their fathers. A land not just of soil and stone, but of destiny. The nation of Israel had been born. But history would not let them rest. Their trials were far from over. Exile, return, and the Second Temple. 538 BCE, 70 CE. The Babylonian exile had changed everything. The temple was gone. Jerusalem was in ruins, and the people of Israel were scattered, longing for home. But exile was not the end of their story. Then, a miracle. Cyrus the Great, the mighty ruler of Persia, conquered Babylon. Unlike the kings before him, he did not seek to erase nations. Instead, he granted them freedom. Let the exiles return. Let them rebuild their temple. For the first time in decades, the Israelites walked the path back to their homeland. But the Jerusalem they returned to was not the city they had left. It was broken, its walls crumbled, its streets empty of life. Despite hardship, the people did what they had done for centuries. They built. Stone by stone, brick by brick, the temple rose again. It was smaller than Solomon's, humbler in its glory, but it was theirs. And as the final walls stood complete, the sound of prayers and sacrifice once again filled the air. Yet not all was well. Foreign rule and the rise of Hellenism. Centuries passed, and the land of Israel became a prize fought over by empires. The Persians fell to Alexander the Great, and with his conquest came a new force, Hellenism. Greek culture swept across the land. Temples to foreign gods rose. Greek philosophy flourished, and even some Jews embraced this new way of life. But with change came oppression. The Greek rulers, especially Antiochus IV, did not just want influence, they wanted control. He outlawed Jewish practices. He desecrated the temple, placing a statue of Zeus inside its sacred walls. Torah scrolls were burned, circumcision was forbidden, and those who resisted faced death. The Jewish people were at a breaking point. And then, from the hills of Judea, a rebellion was born. Mattathias, a Jewish priest, refused to bow. When ordered to sacrifice to Greek gods, he struck down the soldier instead. With his 5 sons, including the fearless Judah Maccabee, he called the people to war. Against all odds, the Maccabees fought. They were outnumbered, poorly armed, facing the greatest military power of their time. But they had something stronger: faith. After years of battle, victory came. The Jews reclaimed Jerusalem, and as they entered the desecrated temple, they purified it, rededicating it to God. But when they searched for oil to light the menorah, they found only enough for one day. Yet the flame did not go out. For 8 days it burned, a sign that even in the darkest times, light could endure. But peace was fleeting. The Greeks were gone, but Rome had taken their place. And Rome was a master of control. At first, they ruled with tolerance, allowing Jewish kings to reign under their watch. But as time passed, the Romans tightened their grip. High taxes, foreign governors, and the looming presence of Roman soldiers filled the streets of Jerusalem. Some Jews sought peace, others whispered of rebellion. A man of unmatched ambition, he was a ruler caught between two worlds. He sought favor with Rome while attempting to win the hearts of his own people. To prove his devotion, he undertook a project so grand it stunned the ancient world. He rebuilt the Second Temple. It was a marvel. Massive white stones, golden rooftops that gleamed under the sun. It stood as the pride of the Jewish people, but beneath its beauty, tension grew. Prophets spoke of coming change. Revolts brewed in the shadows. And the Romans watched with increasing suspicion. The Great Revolt, the fall of the Second Temple. By 66 CE, patience had run out. The Jewish people could bear Roman rule no longer. Led by fierce fighters, they rebelled. Jerusalem turned into a battlefield. For 4 years, they held strong. But Rome did not forget rebellions. In 70 CE, General Titus marched on Jerusalem. With legions of Roman soldiers, he laid siege to the city. Starvation, disease, and terror filled the streets. The temple, the heart of the Jewish people, was set on fire. Flames devoured its golden walls. Smoke darkened the sky. The priests fought to save the sacred scrolls, but nothing could stop the destruction. The Second Temple, the symbol of Jewish faith and identity, was gone. Jerusalem was left in ruins. The Romans crushed the rebellion with brutal force. Thousands were killed. Others were taken as slaves. Scattered across the world, they carried their traditions, their prayers, their hope. Though the temple was gone, the Jewish spirit remained unbroken. The exile would last nearly 2,000 years. But the dream of return, of Jerusalem, of a home, would never fade. Jerusalem burned. The mighty walls that once protected the city lay in ruins. The cries of its people faded into silence as the Roman legions crushed the last remnants of Jewish resistance. The year was 70 CE. The temple, the heart of Jewish faith, was gone. The land that had been promised to their ancestors was no longer theirs. The survivors of Jerusalem fled. Some journeyed to the deserts of Arabia. Some sailed to the shores of North Africa, while others walked into the depths of Europe. But wherever they went, they carried their identity with them. They built synagogues instead of temples. They preserved the Torah when kings and emperors tried to erase it. They whispered their prayers in secret when speaking Hebrew was forbidden. Empires rose and fell. Rome, Byzantium, the caliphates, Christian kingdoms. But the Jews remained. Yet survival came at a price. Persecution and pain. In Europe, rumors spread. Lies were whispered in the dark. They are different. They cannot be trusted. Kings turned against them. Entire communities were blamed for plagues, wars, and famine. They were expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, from Spain in 1492. Those who stayed behind faced forced conversions. Those who refused were hunted. In Eastern Europe, pogroms turned into massacres. Jewish villages were set on fire, their people cut down in the streets. In hidden corners of Europe and the Middle East, rabbis taught the Talmud. Young boys memorized prayers that had been spoken for thousands of years. Families lit Shabbat candles, their flames flickering like a promise. We are still here. Then, in the 19th century, a new idea took root. A place where Jews would no longer be strangers, where they could walk freely, speak their language, and live without fear. Theodor Herzl, a journalist from Vienna, put this dream into words. If you will it, it is no dream. The Zionist movement was born. Jews from Russia, Poland, Yemen, and Morocco began to return to their ancient land. Slowly, they rebuilt. Fields were cultivated. Settlements were established. But the world had not yet seen the darkest chapter. From 1939 to 1945, 6 million Jews were murdered. Entire families vanished overnight. Synagogues burned. Jewish names were erased from history books. The world watched in horror. And for the first time in centuries, something changed. The world finally asked, where do the Jews belong? The answer had always been the same: Israel. And in 1948, after 2,000 years of exile, the dream became reality. The world had watched in silence as 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. Their homes burned, their names erased, their voices silenced. But from the ashes of that horror, a dream long whispered through generations of suffering was about to be realized. The United Nations gathered in 1947 to vote on a historic decision. Would the Jewish people finally have a home of their own? As the votes were counted, hearts pounded. Tears filled the eyes of Holocaust survivors, of refugees who had nowhere left to go. The result: a Jewish state would be established in the land of Israel. Jews danced in the streets. Strangers embraced as if they had known each other forever. After 2,000 years of exile, they were going home. But joy came with fear. The very next day, war loomed on the horizon. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion stood before a crowded hall in Tel Aviv. With a firm voice, he declared, cheers erupted. The dream of Abraham, the kingdom of David, the hope of millions. It was real. But just as the ink dried on Israel's declaration of independence, 5 Arab nations declared war. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, powerful armies, far larger and better equipped, marched toward the newborn state, vowing to destroy it before it could take its first breath. The Jews had no real army, no air force, no tanks. Many fighters were Holocaust survivors who had barely escaped death. And yet, they fought. They fought because there was no other choice. This was their home, and they would not lose it again. Against all odds, Israel won its war of independence. The price was heavy, thousands of lives lost, but the state survived. With independence secured, Israel became a refuge. From across the world, Jews returned. The war-torn streets of Poland, the deserts of Yemen, the mountains of Ethiopia, the last remnants of Jewish life in Arab countries. They came by the thousands, carrying nothing but hope. A nation was reborn, but survival remained a struggle. For 19 years, Jerusalem, the city of kings and prophets, was divided. Jews were forbidden from praying at the Western Wall, their holiest site. But in 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel faced an attack from all sides. And in 6 miraculous days, not only did Israel defend itself, it reclaimed Jerusalem. As Israeli soldiers stood at the Western Wall, tears streamed down their faces. For the first time in 2,000 years, the Jewish people could once again walk freely in the heart of their ancient capital. But Israel's journey was far from over. It would face wars, conflicts, terror, and challenges. And yet, through it all, it would endure, just as it always had. Because Israel is not just a country. It is a testament to survival, faith, and the unbreakable spirit of a people who never gave up on home. For thousands of years, the Jewish people have endured the impossible. They have faced exile, persecution, and near destruction. And yet, every time, they have risen again, stronger, more determined, unshaken in their faith. From Abraham's covenant to the exodus from Egypt, from the destruction of the temple to the rebirth of Israel, Their journey has never been easy. But perhaps that is what makes their story so extraordinary. It is not just a history of survival. It is a testament to resilience, to faith, to destiny. Today, Israel stands as a beacon of hope, but challenges still remain. Wars have not disappeared. Enemies still surround it. The struggle is not over, and yet life goes on. Families celebrate Shabbat. Soldiers stand guard to protect their land. Scientists, doctors, and visionaries shape the future. In every corner of Israel, the spirit of the people continues to shine. A promise that the Jewish people will never be erased. A promise that history bends towards survival. A promise that no matter the challenge, the light of Israel will never go out. The story of Israel is not just history. It is prophecy unfolding before our eyes. What will the next chapter hold? What new trials, what new triumphs will shape the future? This journey is far from over. And if you want to be part of uncovering the next chapter of this extraordinary story, make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and watch till the end. Because history is still being written, and you won't want to miss what happens next.